welcome everybody. Thank you for coming out to let me share my passion with you. About 11 years ago, when I reached my best before date at the university, it was about the time of the financial crisis, 2007, 2008. So this became my passion, my topic of interest, and that's what occupied me ever since. And so far, I haven't solved all the problems, but and it's tough. It really is. As you've heard, the world is blowing up in debt.
There's two at the end there.
Two at the end down there?
There's one here.
Far end.
Far here.
There's two back here.
For some reason, these pointers don't, they show up on the wall, but they don't show up on the screen. Yeah.
Happens when you buy 3 pointers.
Maybe that's why the ones you buy at Best Buy that cost $75, maybe they're
Hello, David.
better
How are you?
for good.
Probably has to do with the,
All right, so this is the first of 3 sessions that I planned. So really the purpose of this first one is to just give you some base introduction of how money is created. And then in the second session I'll talk more about perhaps some reforms that we can consider. And then in the third session I'll talk about the economy and neoliberalism and how our democracy perhaps needs to change. I don't want to get political, but so on. Okay, so today we're going to talk about the basic money creation system, and at the end I'm going to talk about a little bit about the economy. So I'll leave you to read these. I love quotes, and so I'm always looking at quotes, and this is a few ideas about democracy, and I think we have an obligation to be better informed so we become better voters. So I'll let you read those quotes for yourself. So these are the 3 sessions. What are we talking about? Well, first of all, how is money created? This comes from the government website, Library of Parliament. Notice the date on it, 2015. It's sort of a chuckle, because I've seen some videos of some of our politicians and finance ministers even being asked the question, how is money created? And they fumble and bumble and they just can't answer the question. So I think that's why Parliament was motivated maybe to put some information there that MPs could read and learn. So anyway, both private commercial banks and the Bank of Canada create money by extending loans to the Government of Canada, and in the case of private commercial banks, lending to the general public. The Bank of Canada's money creation for the Government of Canada is an internal government process. Internal government process. So this means that external factors, such as financial markets, dysfunction, cannot cause the federal government to run out of money. The government can never run out of money. No matter what politicians tell you, the government cannot run out of money. It can print money forever.
Are you going to take questions from students?
Once in a while, yeah.
So it's money, when you say money, are you meaning bills and
Money,
quarters
all
and
money.
dimes?
All
Or
money.
you're meaning,
Currency, everything.
okay, because there's a lot of money that isn't
Yeah.
currency.
Yeah, money is money. Most of it,
Well, I don't know what
97% of our money is actually numbers in spreadsheets.
Yeah,
All over, yeah. That's money.
so money is just.
Yeah,
what you
digital
say it
money.
is.
Money is an idea.
Money is a number in a spreadsheet. Okay? So, our money then comes from 2 places. Bank of Canada loans to the government, so they can spend money, and private bank loans. Those are 2 sources of money. I always like a little cartoon or two. Money makes the world go round. That's not technically true from an astrophysics perspective. We're going to pull your funding. I stand corrected. Okay, so the Canadian dollar can only be created by the Bank of Canada. It's introduced when the federal government spends money into the economy and when the Bank of Canada loans money to private banks. So at the Bank of Canada, all the private banks have accounts with the Bank of Canada, as does the federal government. So that's where the exchange of money takes place between the government, Bank of Canada, and private banks. The Canadian dollar is a fiat currency. It's a debt money. The money is created out of thin air. Okay? It's worth nothing for its own sake, except you can use it, pay taxes, etc. So the Canadian dollar is a federal government debt. Okay? So this $20 bill I have here means that the federal government owes me $20. If I take it to the federal government, they'll give me $20. Yeah, it looks just like this. Or I can use it to pay my taxes. All right? But otherwise, I mean, if I was to go to middle of Africa and say, here's $20, they'd laugh at me because it's a piece of paper, worthless piece of paper. Isn't it? It takes about, what, 19 cents to produce these or something. So the Canadian dollar is a federal government debt. The federal government promises to repay $1 Canadian dollar for every Canadian dollar I give them. However, we can at least think of it as a tax credit. We can at least use it to pay our taxes. If you're interested in the business about what's the value of the coinage that's produced, or these pieces of paper, that's called seigniorage, and you can find information about the actual value of this piece of paper on the Bank of Canada website, if you're interested.
So does the government have a gold reserve or not?
Pardon me?
Does the government have a gold reserve? People
No,
talk about
no. That's what we have a fiat currency. We have a fiat money, and there's no gold reserve. The end of the gold reserve in the U.S. was 1971, when the U.S. had spent so much money on the Vietnam War, and they had so much debt. And at those days, I think they were promising, what, $35 an ounce of gold? And they had such a huge debt they built up with the Vietnam War that Charles de Gaulle, the president of France, said, hey boys, I'd like some gold for all this money I have, all this US dollars I have. And Nixon said, no way. So he went off the gold standard. So that was basically the end of the gold standard.
The same in Canada?
Yeah. Well, everything was tied to the US. So thinking of the economy then, we're going to be concentrating on financial assets, not looking at real assets or human assets. We're concentrating on financial assets and how it relates across these three sectors: the government sector, the private sector, and the foreign sector. And we'll look at the finance sector as a special case of the private sector a little bit later. So when we look at the economy then, you see the flow, the financial flows that move around. The government spends money into the economy and they receive taxes back. The private sector, there's government expenses coming in, payments coming in from individuals, and then wages and profits are going out. The foreign sector, you have funds going net both ways, and this is just the net foreign earnings that come from the foreign sector. So we have a flow of money, okay, and this is all debt. Money is debt. So these are financial obligations that are being passed around the economy. All money is debt. Okay, first of all, talk about private banks. They are lawfully permitted to make loans in Canadian currency. That's the chartered banks. Loans are debt contracts between a bank and an individual. They're a contract. So I go into the bank and I want to borrow some money. I have to sign a contract. I give the contract to the bank, and the bank puts money in my account. So we've now created money. All right, that's how money is created. So then I, as an individual, am free to write checks on that account. So new loans increase the money supply, right? New loans increase the money supply, and when the repaid loans, they decrease the money supply. So the money supply goes up and down with the loans. The more loans you have, the bigger the money supply.
But I write checks on my account that I haven't got a loan for.
No,
I
you
deposit
don't.
stuff.
You don't. But somebody created that money in order for that money to go into your account at the bank.
I earned it,
Okay, but somebody paid you.
yes,
Yeah, where did they get the money?
because they charged you money for
Okay.
that service.
Yeah, so money is just debt contracts moving around the economy.
Okay.
Just like your pension payments that go into your account. Right, that comes from somebody's debt. Corporations have money that they borrow from the bank in order to pay their bills. Okay, so it's all debt moving around. A large majority of the loans made by private banks, however, are mortgage contracts, as you can imagine. The big mortgages you have to take out. All right, so thinking of these financial assets, you go in as a borrower, you sign a loan contract, and the bank puts loan money in your account. So your asset is the loan money, and the liability is the loan contract that you've signed, all right? It's your liability, and the loan money is your asset. For the bank, the asset is the loan contract, and their liability is the money that they've allowed you to spend. As soon as they say, here, John, you're allowed to spend $100, they have a liability. Because they're going to have to come up with that $100 that you spend, whether you write a check or whatever. So every financial asset, there's an asset and a liability. There's two parts. So the total of the financial assets created is equal to the total of the financial liabilities created. Right? There's always a one-to-one relationship. Okay?
I thought there was some instances where they won't give you money if you don't have assets outside of the money they're giving you.
Well, that's just your collateral-free loan, whether the bank's going to trust you to repay. You're going to take out a loan contract with the bank. Are they going to trust you to repay it? Well, maybe if you don't have a job, don't have any money, don't have any assets,
They won't give you.
they might not give you any money.
Why is there
We've
so
got
much
another one
debt?
behind you.
Pardon me?
10 years
Oh, sorry.
before the financial crisis started.
Just going to ask about the concept of quantitative easing.
That's coming up later, yeah. That's a very relevant question. That's coming up, yeah.
So what happens, Dave, when you're in the example that says some big dollars and you see cash? And how does that do?
Yeah. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that, of all the sloshing of money around the system, but that comes later. Okay, this is a really short little video that talks about money.
Why is there so much debt? 10 years before the financial crisis started, individuals and families in the UK had a total of £480 billion of debt. Since then, our debt has more than doubled. But who did we borrow all this money from? Was it from an army of grannies who have spent their whole lives putting money away for a rainy day? No. When you go into a bank and borrow a large amount of money to buy a small amount of house, that money doesn't come from somebody else's savings. It's just created out of nothing by the bank with a few taps on a computer keyboard. Sounds crazy, right? But this isn't some crime of the century. It's just the way the banks work. Here's how the Bank of England describes it. When banks make loans, they create additional deposits for those that have borrowed the money. Those additional deposits are just the numbers that appear in your account, which you can use to pay for your new house. In fact, around 97% of all the money that exists is created in this way, out of nothing, when banks make loans. Every loan they make creates brand new money in the economy, whether it's a personal loan, car finance, or mortgage. Now, here's the problem. If almost all the money we use is created by banks when they make the loans, then for every pound of money, there has to be a pound of debt. If we want more money in the economy, we have to go further into debt to the banks, because more borrowing from banks means more new money is created. But the process happens in reverse when we repay loans. When we pay down our debts, the money effectively disappears. This makes it impossible for all of us to reduce our debts. If we start paying it all, then the amount of money in the economy shrinks. Less money in the economy means less spending, and less spending means fewer jobs. So there's the choice. We can have either more money and more debt, or we can have less debt and less money. When the only way to get money into the economy is to borrow from the banks that create it, then we'll always be trapped under a mountain of debt. But it doesn't have to be this way. If we took the power to create money away from banks, and instead have money created by a public institution that isn't chasing short-term profits, then this new money, as it supports jobs and the economy, could be used to pay down the debt. And we could finally start to clear this mountain.
So this video comes from the Positive Money organization that started in Britain. There's a number of different organizations that are trying to change how we create money in the world. And one of the organizations is the Positive Money organization in Britain. And they have a set of proposals. And that's just one of a number of proposals.
So when money is created on a piece of paper, then how do they determine how much cash needs to be circulated in the community, like in the country? You know, like, I mean, they
You
obviously
mean
have,
this- you mean
money is
this
made.
stuff? Or
Yeah,
you-
like money is made at a mint, right?
Yes.
So how do they know how much of that to make?
Well, the demand would come from banks probably, because they're the ones that actually dish out the coinage and the bills.
So every time a loan is made, an order goes into the mint? No.
No. Most of the money, it goes via electronic processes.
Yeah.
You write a check, or now you do it online, you put numbers into your computer.
Okay, I hear that.
Not much of it is this stuff anymore, right? You use a
Right.
credit card or a debit card.
Yeah.
Right.
So it's numbers in the ledgers, basically, what
Yeah,
you're saying.
numbers in the ledger.
Yeah, I hear that. I just wondered how they know how much cash to have.
Well, banks actually don't carry a lot of cash. Have you ever gone in and asked for
Yeah.
a large amount of cash?
No.
Oh, well, sorry, could you come back, sir?
Yeah.
Especially if you want foreign currency.
Ah, sure, that's true.
So, private banks are creators of credit. They are not lenders of savers' deposits. And yet, every introductory economics text talks about the loanable funds theory. They tell you that a bank is an intermediary between someone who needs money and someone who wants to save money. And that's the loanable funds theory, and that's what we've all been taught in economics ever since I don't know when. And they still believe that, but it's not true. Private banks are creators of credit, not lenders of savings, okay? It doesn't matter how much people have saved. The private banks can create money till the cows come home.
But they're supposed to have some sort of limit on how.
Okay, at the Bank of Canada, all the private banks have to have a capital reserve. Okay, but that's not a problem, because if the private bank is having difficulty, meeting its reserve, they just call up the Bank of Canada and say, would you put a few more million in my account? And they charge them 0.5%. Okay, so it's not a problem. The Bank of Canada will give them all the money they want if they need it.
Well, there are problems.
Oh, sure. For sure, there are.
So if.
That's one of our problems.
If I was okay for a loan for 500,000 for a house, and then we signed the paper, and then I asked for it in cash, they would be flummoxed.
Oh, they wouldn't be able to, they'd say, give me a few weeks, but. That's right.
At some point, will you explain the difference between the way our banks are set up and the way they're set up in the States? Like in terms of the crash that happened in the States because the banks are set up differently than
Well, that had more to do with the kinds of loans that were made, the kind of financial contracts that were made. And a little bit later on, I'm going to talk about the financial market. And I call it a casino, because that's really what it is. And that's part of the problem, is that the kinds of instruments that are created in the casino just blow your mind. And it was the creation of these mortgage bundles, for instance, in the US, that were not nearly as safe as they were supposed to be, because they were portfolios of many, many, many mortgages. Turned out to be a lot worse than that. And it just kept building up and eventually crashed. But that's the, yes, that. So, just to review, borrowing creates new currency, but there's no new financial wealth overall. Okay? Because banks are creating loans, and at the same time, there's the assets, there's the liabilities. So there's always a balance between the two, okay?
And is
So
that,
the more debt, then the more financial assets, okay? So there's net same amount of money.
Dave, is that also because the banks are private and they have shareholders? And so there's always interest charges on that.
That's coming, that's right. Yeah.
Whereas when that
We're gonna talk about interest.
positive money, then there wouldn't be that.
That's right, and that adds to the cost, that's right, it's coming up next. Yeah. So overall debt determines the money supply and drives the economy. And private banks create, I'm just saying over 90%, I don't know what the figure is in Canada. They say 95% in the US, they say 97% in the UK. I have no idea what it actually is in Canada, but I'm thinking it must be over 90, because we're very similar in economy.
Are there certain criteria that, like say one of the private banks is asked to give a loan that's a large amount, and they go to the Bank of Canada to get that money?
No, they have to
They
go through
don't?
private banks. No, you can't deal with the Bank of Canada directly.
Oh,
You have to go through the private banks. Only the government can deal with the Bank of Canada.
oh, okay.
And the private bank.
And the private banks, yes. Yeah. So the private bank would have to be your agent. Oh, look what I just got from my bank. So here's a little example just to make a point. Paul, Mary, and George each obtained loans of $1,000 from their respective banks, TD, BMO, and Royal. Right, so they each get a loan of $1,000. Each then has $1,000 added to their checking accounts at their respective banks because they signed a loan contract, so they now have an extra $1,000 in their bank account. So at this point, there's $3,000 additional dollars been added to the money supply. Paul then writes a check for $1,000 to Mary for bookkeeping services, and George writes Paul a check for $1,000 for plumbing services. And finally, Mary writes a check to George for $1,000 for new computer software. So each of these individuals then deposit these checks with their respective banks and use it to discharge the loans. And so now the money supply has been reduced by $3,000. All right? So the money supply went up by $3,000 and then was reduced by $3,000. However, there's also the loan interest. Okay, so let's say each of the individuals had to pay loan interest charges, say $50 for borrowing the money. So there's another $150 that we have to come up with to pay the interest. Okay? So there's the cost. So therefore, money creation is not free. Costs money. So just a quick review here. So there's no limit on the number or amount of loan contracts. Private banks can always obtain money from the Bank of Canada. And the private bank money is created out of thin air. That's the point. It's created out of thin air.
You just said that they can't go to the Bank of Canada for money.
No, I'm talking about a private bank.
Private bank.
A private bank.
No, but if with the private, no, that's not what I meant. I meant if a private bank wanted to loan somebody like big amount of money, say a company or something like that.
Yeah, if they had a problem where they had loaned so much money that they had passed their capital reserve requirements, then they'd have to ask Bank of Canada to put a little bit more money in their account at the Bank of Canada.
Okay.
They borrow it.
That's kind of your question.
They borrow it. But
So
they
it-
borrow it very cheaply, 0.5%.
Is there a criteria around how much a private bank can get from the Bank of Canada?
Oh, I have no idea.
Oh,
You know, in Canada, we're talking about these big guys, right? TD, BMO, Royal, and I think those are big bucks.
yeah.
So they must maintain a certain level of capital reserves at the Bank of Canada. The important thing is that the level of debt money in circulation is demand-driven, right? So the economy demands money for business, consumption, and so on, right? So in good times, when businesses are booming, they're spending more money, they're making more investment, there's a higher demand for loans, right? In bad times, this winds down, there's less money needed, and so the amount of money in circulation will fall. So it goes up and down with the cycle. We'll see that later.
What does capital reserve mean?
Money, financial reserves. Usually bonds.
So they can't lend out all the money? Is that what you're saying?
No, just think of it, at the Bank of Canada, all the private banks have an account with the Bank of Canada. There's money in that account. That's their reserve, their capital reserve.
But they've
Usually
loaned it
bonds.
out. They've loaned it out, so they
No,
can't.
they haven't
lend
loaned
it
that out. They haven't loaned that out. That's, the money that's at the Bank of Canada, belonging to private banks, is their capital reserve.
That's their collateral.
Yeah, that's their collateral.
percentage of their total loan.
Yeah.
So it's not assets.
Well, it is assets for the bank.
But it's
Because the
not,
people who set up the bank had to come up with that capital in the first place. Right?
but they borrowed it from somewhere, you said. So they don't have it.
Well, they would have had to, yes, at some point, they would have had to acquire government bonds, because there would be government bonds sitting in their account, Bank of Canada.
So is the reserve over and above the deposits? Or is it part of the deposits part of it?
Part of it, yeah.
Or is it just an asset of the bank that it's earned by its doing business?
No, the money that's sitting at the Bank of Canada, they don't want to have too much money, they just want to have what they're required to have. Because that money's not earning anything. Right?
So if they've earned that money in previous years' profit.
Well, that's part of their capital, yeah. Cost of doing business.
But the Bank of Canada would get concerned if it felt that the money that these private banks was loaning out was not adequately, didn't have good.
Right, I'm going to talk about the Bank of Canada in just a minute. And so the Bank of Canada tries to regulate how much money is actually flowing out there using the interest rate, and that's one of the head stuff.
So no inflation.
So is the superintendent of financial institutions part of the Bank of Canada?
Is what?
The superintendent of financial institutions is part of the Bank of Canada?
No, that's a government.
Federal government.
That's part of the federal government. So once again, private banks, there's money going out to loans, repayment of loans, so the total new debt is always equal to the total new money. I love making diagrams. I'm a big picture person, I always tell Nancy. So here's the money machine. Okay, private banks, individual checking accounts. You have savings, payments, and taxes going one way, wages, loans, receipts, and so on, government grants going the other way. So, now to interest. Loans come with interest obligations. So repayment requires interest plus principal. So over time, the amount of debt money needed must increase to cover interest costs. Right? It's got to come from somewhere. Imagine if the amount of debt money was fixed. You'd only have so much. So there was no extra money to pay interest. It'd be sort of like the game of musical chairs. Did any of you play musical chairs as a child? So at the end of the term, you've got to come up with money to pay the interest as well as repay the principal. But if there's only a certain amount of money available total, we're in trouble, aren't we? Somebody's taken one chair away from the musical chairs game. So money creation costs money. It's a cost to the economy because these chairs are not free. Okay? So many of the money reform proposals advocate alternative systems of money creation, and we'll talk more about that in the second session about positive or possible reforms. But I threw this in here. I was thinking today of the musical chairs. I remember playing this as a kid. And so remember how music plays and go around and then all of a sudden somebody pulls a chair up. And, so really what's happening is the bank is taking one chair away. So if you want to keep playing the game, you have to put that chair back. And anyway, that's musical chairs. Actually, you have to put two chairs back, right? Because you have to pay for the interest. So this is just an idea of what that interest cost might be. This is what happens to $1 if you let it grow for 50 years. If it's 6%, that $1 becomes $18. At 4%, it becomes $7, and at 2%, it becomes $2.69. So this shows you the magic of the compounding from the paying of interest. In other words, if you borrowed a certain amount of money, but you didn't actually pay it back, so the next period, you had to pay the interest on that money, but you have to borrow that because you can't afford it. And so it would just grow over time. That's what we call Ponzi finance, and I'll talk about that in the third session. So let's take a look at this example. Let's say the country of Utopia uses a fiat currency to facilitate the trades and goods and services among its citizens. The Central Bank of Utopia maintains transaction accounts for all residents over the age of 18. The transaction account is used to receive payments and make payments. And all corporate entities and government service are also included in these transaction accounts. At the end of each month, each resident must clear their account balance to zero. So it's like your credit card. You try to pay it off at the end of the month, right? So if you have a surplus, it can be automatically transferred to a savings account, or if you have a deficit, it can be transferred automatically to a loan account. So we're dreaming an ideal country here, Utopia. So money is free for 30 days, all right? So the central bank maintains the system using a system of spreadsheets where the amounts are just transferred between individuals making payments or receiving payments or whatever. And it's all managed by the central bank, and there's no service charge. Wouldn't that be nice? No service charge. All right, that's scenario A. Now let's look at scenario B. The government contracts with a private company to assume the role of central banker. The private company manages the payments and accounting system. The private company charges the government of Utopia a monthly fee for this fiat money creation service. Now let's assume that the fee is based on the total value of all payments that are made by all the residents over a 30-day period. These payments are made on behalf of government, private business, and so on. So the fee is a percentage of of all the payments that were processed, all the money used over that month, all right? Charge a fee, percentage fee. Well, at the end, they not only have to pay a fee on the amount of payments that have been processed, but they owe a certain amount of money now for the fee, so that'll have to be added to the payments for next time, because they owe for the fee, right? So the next month, they have all the payments plus the fee that they owe. Okay? So you can see that over time, when you keep adding the fees on to the payments that are being processed, how the bill gets higher and higher, okay? And that's closer to reality.
So should we buy bank shares?
Yeah. Right. So, when you think about that debt growth chart that we just looked at on the previous slide, is it any wonder why economies have to grow just to stay the same? Just to survive, right? We must have growth. If we don't have growth, we can't pay for our money. So when politicians talk about economic growth, you have to have economic growth. Where does the interest come from? I like this cartoon here. We need a new loan in order to pay the interest on our previous loan. The banker says, I've invented a perpetual mortgage. All right, before I talk about the Bank of Canada, you don't have this slide, because I thought when I was looking at it, I would well mention about the Bank of England, because really this is where the current modern banking system really began, was with the Bank of England back in 1694, actually, was when the bank was established. But it's kind of an interesting story. If you recall at that time in history, there were a lot of wars being fought in Europe, if you think of history. And this is just one example. Imagine, so what the government's major cost then was supplying their armies and paying for armaments and so on. So England's crushing defeat by France, the dominant naval power at the time, became a catalyst for England's rebuilding itself as a global power. And England had no choice but to build a more powerful navy. But unfortunately, no public funds were available, and the credit of William III at the time was pretty low in London. So it wasn't really possible for him to borrow all these dollars or pounds that he needed, even when he was offering 8% per annum interest. So he went to the bankers or the money guys in England, and they set up this company, and it was called the Bank of England. And they agreed to supply him with the money he needed at a charge. So they set up the Bank of England. And look at this. They would give him all the cash he needed. They would manage his finances. And the government in return would give him, or give the Bank of England loans, or bonds, I should say, bonds. Now, the bank could then use those bonds as collateral and lend money to the public. And so the Bank of England got a good deal here. Not only were they lending money to the government and getting interest on that, they got bonds as collateral, and then they could use the bonds as reserves, if you like, and they could lend money to the public using those as reserves. So it was wonderful. And that's really how the modern banking system got going. And we basically copied that. An interesting side effect, this expenditure of money really put England on the map in terms of being able to compete in world markets by being able to spend money on ironworks, their navy, so it made them a very strong and powerful country in the end. So, the Bank of Canada. It's a crown corporation led by a governing council and a board of directors. The governing council is made up of the governor, the senior deputy director, and 4 additional deputy directors. So these are all employees, basically. The board of directors is composed of the governor, the senior deputy governor, the deputy minister of finance, and 12 outside directors that are appointed by the minister of finance. So these are outside people. These are political appointments. And the bank exists to regulate credit and currency. Responsibility for the oversight of payments and other clearing and settlement systems. So this comes from the Bank of Canada website. So monetary policy, getting back to what Don asked, the bank influences supply of money circulating in the economy using monetary policy. And monetary policy is basically playing with the interest rate, playing with the prime rate. It's a pretty weak stick, but that's what bankers like to use. The financial system, so they manage the financial system, they want it to be efficient and sound and so on. And they're responsible for the bank notes part of the currency, not the coins that come from the Royal Canada Mint, but they're responsible for the bank notes. And of course, fiscal management for the government of Canada. They like to help the government manage its money.
How does inflation fit into this, Dave?
Well, it does. Can I save that till later, in later sessions? Because we'll come back to that, you know. Yes?
Do you know when the Bank of Canada was formed in Canada?
Yes, and that's actually, I'm going to talk a lot more about the Bank of Canada in the second session. But it was 1934 and then 1937. 1934 it started, but that was when it was private, and then it became public corporation, Crown Corporation in 1937. But I'll talk about that next time. So, the Bank of Canada maintains accounts with the federal government and with private banks, as I said earlier. The government creates money by requesting the Bank of Canada to add money to its Bank of Canada account. So, when the federal government needs money, they go to the Bank of Canada, they say, we would like so many million, and they write out bonds and give them to the Bank of Canada. So basically they're borrowing money from the Bank of Canada so they can fund their government expenses. All right? So the Bank of Canada gets bonds, Government of Canada bonds, and the federal government gets money. But the money is just numbers in a spreadsheet at the Bank of Canada, nothing else. Yes?
Would the Bank of Canada ever turn them down and say, no, you can't do this because you've got too much debt?
No.
Or too much, you've already paid too much interest?
No.
But they help them manage it, so what?
They do, yeah. Well, I must have some tete-a-tetes, I don't know. Well, that would be below the political level, I think. The interesting thing here is that these bonds that the Bank of Canada holds, I don't mind that. But then what the Bank of Canada does is it sells these bonds on the market. All right? If the Bank of Canada bonds stayed at the Bank of Canada, then all the interest paid by the federal government on these bonds would stay in the Bank of Canada. And who owns the Bank of Canada? The federal government. All right? So the interest would be our own. Thank you. Right? But no. These bonds are sold out on the market. You can go to your broker and buy bonds. In fact, I was looking yesterday, and you know, the Bank of Canada bonds vary from 1% to a little over 2%, depending on whether it's 1 year or 25 years. So, what the federal government is actually doing is they're creating investment instruments that permit individuals such as you and I to invest, permits us to save. So we're doing us a favor. Or are they? So the federal government is therefore paying interest to the private sector on the money that the Bank of Canada creates for government spending. All right, and I'll talk more about this next week when I talk about reform.
There's no definition on who can buy the bonds.
No.
So a lot of foreign governments are.
That's true. Oh yeah. In fact, you know, if foreign governments will buy our bonds, that helps us with trade imbalances, for instance. Okay? If we buy a lot more from China, and we do, when we sell them, then we have a heavy trade imbalance. If they'll buy our bonds, that's good. Okay? It helps us. That's how the U.S. government survives with all of their, you know how bad their debt is with China. You hear about it all the time. So the Chinese are happy to buy the American bonds because they do get a little interest to their money. So the debt, the total value of all the bonds outstanding in this federal government account is the federal government's debt. Okay? And as bonds mature, the federal government will have to replace these bonds with new bonds. Okay? The bonds sold by Canada will be at a discount if they're the treasury bill type of bond. That is, let's say the face value is $1,000 and it's 90 days or a year or whatever, and the bank would have to sell it at a discount, and then this difference between the discount and the face value will be the earning or the interest that is earned by the person who bought the bond. Incoming tax revenues, however, can reduce the level of debt. Federal government transactions with the economy go through the Bank of Canada to the private bank's account, and now there's a not-for-profit company called Payments Canada that was set up in 1980 or 81, which handles all the transactions among all the players in the financial market. So they make sure that he gets his dollar and she gets her dollar and so on. So each year, the federal government deficit represents the difference between the increase in the total bond liabilities for the year minus any new additions to the asset account from taxes. All right, so when the federal government spends money, they add new bonds. When they collect taxes, they have tax money coming back, and so that tax money will help to eliminate some of the bonds to reduce the level of debt. Crushed by that bond. So just to review some facts. So I said over 90% of the currency in circulation is debt. Most of this debt, however, has been created by private banks, not government. However, without debt, there would be no money in circulation. The level of private bank debt is based on the demand from individuals and businesses. So debt creation incurs an interest cost. The Bank of Canada also creates money for use by the federal government. The federal government issues bonds to fund the expenditure, and the federal government pays interest on the debt. So those are the things that we got out of what I said, hopefully. Another picture. I always like drawing pictures. So the federal government's role, central bank, taxes go into the central bank, expenditures come out into the economy and private banks. So there's the federal government expenditure, that's how much they spend, minus whatever taxes they collect is the federal deficit for the year. All right, so they spend money for the year, they get some money back in taxes, and the difference is the deficit. We hear our politicians talk about it all the time. The government deficit. So I like this little figure because it emphasizes the role that the federal government has in the economy, all right? So the federal government is spending money into the economy. The federal government is spending money into the economy, and taxes are coming back out. But this money that's going into the economy is what stimulates the economy, which creates jobs, and we'll come back to that. I'd like to show this picture, and this comes from the modern monetary theory movement, which we'll talk more about later, because it emphasizes the importance that the government has in the economy. Too often what you hear nowadays is the chart would be drawn differently. The private sector would be up here. They're the creators. They're the drivers of the economy, and the government's sitting over here as sort of a subsidiary. So I'm just making the government as being the driver of the economy. All right.
Nate,
Yeah.
you've got this relationship between federal government and Bank of Canada and so on. Where does Alberta fit in that? Where does the state of Edmonton, like at different levels of government?
That's right, that's different government. This is just federal. Yeah. I am going to talk about the provincial government next time when I talk about ATB and provincial banks, because that's a separate. I mean, the federal government gives money to all the provinces for grants, right? There's always big money grants every year that come from the federal government to the provinces. Okay. In fact, that could be done better too, and I'll mention that in a second. Not that we'll ever succeed in convincing bankers, but... All right, what I'd like to do is to think about how the economy works. And you don't get this from, you know, the neoliberal guys. But what the federal government is doing is they're really allocating workers, aren't they? And when the federal government spends money, it's allocating workers in the economy. All right, it's saying, hey, I want some of you guys over here doing our stuff. We want to have more roads, we want to have more buildings, we want to have these goodies, we want to pay health care. So we want to take some of these workers to do things that the government wants to do, all right? So the government is basically saying, we want to allocate part of the capacity of the economy towards government service, all right? Sure, it costs money, but money shouldn't be the issue. The issue is we are taking some of the workers in our economy to provide goods and services for the public. But we're sharing with the private sector, so the government takes W1 workers and the private sector takes W2 workers. We're sharing. So, thinking about how the economy has its ups and downs, there are times when there's high unemployment, when the economy is not doing very well, and this is when government comes in riding on a white steed and says, we'll help you out. So the government needs to spend money to hire these workers that are unemployed. All right. So the federal government needs to counterbalance the economy. That's why I voted Liberal in the last election. Imagine that. They were the only party that said, we've got to spend money on infrastructure. Right? We had the 2008 crisis, the economy was down, and the Liberal Party was the only one that said, we're going to spend money on infrastructure. I couldn't believe Ed Broadbent, or not Ed Broadbent, who was the guy, NDP guy, still worrying about the debt. Yeah, he's still worried about the debt. So, government has to recognize that we have to stimulate the economy when things are bad, but to stay out a little bit when things are good. In other words, let more of the workers go over to the private sector when the private sector needs them. Okay? So we have to be a counterbalance. And this is called fiscal policy. Fiscal policy is when the government spends money to hire workers, build bridges, whatever. Right, Bill? Build bridges. For some reason, I don't know what it was, I guess it was with neoliberalism, but by the 1980s, the bankers in Bank of Canada thought only of monetary policy. All we're going to do is we're going to control the interest rate. If we control the interest rate, everything else will be fine. They forgot about employment. At one time, the Bank of Canada thought about both the monetary policy and the employment. If the unemployment rate was too high, that also entered into their calculation of what to do with the prime rate. But not anymore. It's all monetary policy controlling the interest rate, period. All right, here's a joke that I kind of like. It was told by Ellen Brown in one of her videos. But she's an author who's written a number of books on debt, and I like this joke. About a year after Hurricane Katrina had devastated the city of New Orleans, the mayor was speaking with an alien who had just disembarked from a spaceship. The alien expressed concern that there was so much damage even a year after the flood. The alien asked the mayor if perhaps they lacked the labor to repair the damage. And the mayor replied, oh, there's many willing, able workers. Well, we're good there. The alien then asked if perhaps maybe they lack the necessary materials. And the mayor replied, no, they actually have the necessary materials. All we lack, he said, is money required to get the process started. The alien shakes his head, walks back to his spaceship, and reports to his shipmates, no intelligent life here on Earth. In other words, coming up with the money to repair the damage was more than they could handle. Right? That's what's wrong. Okay. So, the federal government has an annual budget for expenditures. These expenditures represent an allocation of a portion of the total GDP of the country to federal government goods and services. By spending this budget amount into the economy, the federal government is also adding currency into the economy. So a portion of the total economic resources are being used for the public benefit. So in that diagram, this debt, federal government dollars, is the debt initially created by the Bank of Canada to cover its expenditure. The net level of expenditure, however, is reduced by collecting taxes back. All right, so the deficit can be reduced by making taxes, making you pay taxes. So the government's choice of expenditure level and tax level determine the allocation of the nation's output capacity between the public and the private sectors. So you think about it, the government pays wages to its workers, people who are employed in the government sector. But those wages go out to the economy, all right? If the government didn't tax at all, then all that money that was paid as wages is out there in the private sector, let's say available to spend on private sector output. So the amount that the government takes back in taxes affects how much is circulating in the economy. Now, of course, individuals can always make a choice to save a portion of their income, and I will talk about that in a minute too. So once again, my favorite little picture. About 20% of the Canada GDP comes from the government spending. About 20% of the GDP comes from Canada government spending. So money gives the economy life. Once again, another picture. Government spends, goods and services go to the economy, wages go to the private sector to spend on goods and services. The private sector, savings and payments coming in, government sector expense coming in, wages going out, taxes going back out to the government, and output from the private sector going out. And then finally, the finance sector, which I call the casino. The finance sector has a lot of financial instruments, if you like, that don't really do anything for what I think of as the real economy. Finance sector, sure, it has the commercial banks, it has loans, it has bonds, but it has stock market, it has derivatives, all kinds of fancy other instruments that people put their money into. And that doesn't come into the real economy. It stays over there in the casino. All right? So it doesn't help the real economy. It's where we take our money to gamble. Okay, folks. This is the only equation I can do, right? It's the only one, I promise. The only one, okay? So don't run. Don't call 911. If you've ever taken a sort of 2-semester econ course, some of you may have, way back in your life, you would have done a section on macroeconomics. You would have done a section. And right at the beginning of macroeconomics, they talk about the national accounts. Because if you're going to talk about the economy as a whole, you have to talk about the national accounts, okay? So that's what we're going to do. This is the only equation I'm going to refer to in the 3 sessions, I promise. So, we can look at it in terms of income. Let me pass out these things first. And then, Let me just take, this is the same one, but I'll start from the back and move on. So this thing here on the left-hand side, Y, is either the total value of income spent or the total value of production. So it's either national income or gross national product, but it's the same thing, okay? So we can look at it in two different ways. The income, all right, think of the income of everybody in the country, all right? They spend some of their money on consumption. They save some of their money. And they pay taxes. Okay? With the production side, there's consumption, government. So there's consumption goods, government goods, investment goods, and the difference between exports and imports. All right, so on this side is all the goods, consumption goods, government, investment goods, like when you're investing in new buildings, new roads, what have you, investment goods. And then net imports, which is the difference between imports and exports. So this represents all of the categories that I could classify the national economy. And if you just take these two equations, eliminate Y, eliminate C, you get this, okay? So it's just basic algebra that you would have got way back when, I can't even remember. But this is the equation I want us to be able to focus on a few times in the course. And I wish our politicians would too. On this side is the government deficit. On this side is the difference between saving and investment. And finally, the difference between imports and exports. And that basically sums up what's going on in the economy. So when you think about the government deficit, you have to think of it in these terms. The only way that I can make this be zero is I have to have that these two are equal and this is zero, right? So what happens is that if all of the savings doesn't go into investment, but some of it goes somewhere else, then how am I going to get these two to be the same? Okay, so the problem with government deficit is it's also a function of savings versus investment and imports versus exports. And the problem we're having in the economy these days is that there's too much S and not enough I, because I is the investments in the real economy. So this is entrepreneurs, businesses spending money on new equipment, new investment, okay, things that will grow the economy. And if we don't put all of our savings into growing by investment, then how are we going to get a zero deficit? So the problem is saving tends to exceed investment. And so that's why government has to come in as the pony, or the white horse, or whatever, and have a deficit. You need to have a deficit in order to make this equation work. So we'll come back to that a few times. But you know, politicians, they always scream about the deficit, don't they? We can't afford to spend. You know, we're spending more than we're taking in. We're taking our grandchildren's money, etc. I love this picture. This picture explains the equation, okay? Jim, I was thinking of you here. Remember when you said to me, always follow the money, Dave? Well, this is what we're doing here. We're following the money, all right? So here is the production sector, all right? So we had government, consumption, investment, and exports versus imports, all right? So this little box here, all right, this little box here, with these arrows going in, is that equation that we saw with That's this equation over here, okay? That's just saying the same thing as this box, all right? These arrows going in, okay? And then the thing coming out, that's Y, that's the gross domestic product. That was Y. That's Y, okay? So if you like pictures, and then for households, we had taxes, consumer spending, and savings. Okay, savings going this way, taxes going this way, consumer spending going that way. So this one, and this one, whoops, this one here, are the other, okay?
So that makes it look like,
Pardon me?
that makes it look like the only source of taxes is the people's household.
Right.
No, he's got financial markets going there too.
That's right, yeah.
So the problem is that.
So businesses also pay tax too, right?
Yeah, and I think that's collapsed into the cost of production somewhere. Good question.
And aren't there taxes on goods that come into the country?
Yeah, that would be over here though. I don't, this is a simplified picture.
David, what's your leakage to casinos?
Okay. This is my own little, these are the financial markets, so savings come in. Borrowing goes back out to firms and so on for investment, etc. But in this financial markets, there's a lot of stuff going on in here that doesn't go back into the real economy.
You got that right.
All right? So I say leakage to the casino. And there's lots of money there. And here's the financial market. There's all kinds of stuff here going on. Only some of it is relevant to the real economy. A lot of this stuff is not part of the real economy, except it might provide some profits to somebody, but otherwise it's just money spinning around in the casino. Okay? That's the financial market. I mean, it does serve some useful functions, the bond market, exchange rate, currency, and so on. So there are useful things going on to help the economy, but there's also a lot of things going on in the casino, even the stock market. New stocks are like new investment, but the stocks that are already there in the stock market, they're not contributing to the economy anymore. That's just part of the casino, right? Because the stock prices are rising and falling as the market. But that's not contributing to it only contributes to the real economy when new stock is issued, right? That's new investment. So, that's all I was planning to do today. Next time I wanted to talk about changes that we could make to how we handle money at the national level, how we handle money at the provincial level, and then I'll come back to this economy diagram.
So when governments talk about cutbacks on services and public sector wages, that actually slows the economy because they're not spending.
Yeah. In fact, I'm going to spend a lot of time in the third section on that very thing. And that's when I start talking about neoliberalism and handbag economics. That's when I really get political. Yes.
I have two comments. One is that my parents and grandparents understood well what you're saying, because suddenly after the Depression in 1939, there was money to do everything.
Yeah.
The second point is that my former neighbor, who grew up in Germany and was about 13 years old when the war ended, he invests in gold because he remembers the
Gold standard.
nothing almost.
And gold goes up and down like a yo-yo. Right now, I understand that the Russians are buying all the gold they can get their hands on, and the Chinese, I believe, too, because they feel that the American dollar eventually is just going to become worthless. So there's, hedging their bets buying gold.
But gold has very little intrinsic value.
That's right, that's right. So, the problem is that the US currency is the sort of standard, base currency for the world. I think 60% of the currency of the world is US currency, all countries. And, but they're printing so much money. It just, as you know, have you ever seen the debt clock? Well, and a lot of it is over here in the casino.
Yeah.
Like take the stock market. This free money, quantitative easing, this free money that's been created, that the bankers thought, well, if we just give the bankers all this free money, they'll lend it out, and investors will invest in the economy, and there'll be more investment and more jobs, and so on and so forth. The economy will grow. Didn't happen. Didn't happen. What did happen, however, is all the big companies borrowed at cheap rates, close to 0%. And what they did, they bought back their stock. All right? So instead of having, say 1,000 shares, they reduce it to 500 shares by buying back 500 shares, and that boosts the stock price. So you look at the New York Exchange stock price, it's just going like this, isn't it? And that's all these buybacks that are pushing up the stock price. It's a Ponzi scheme. A Ponzi scheme.
Well, but they don't regulate it properly either.
No.
I mean, there's absolutely no benefit in any economy for short sellers. There's no benefit in the economy of derivatives, and they do nothing.
And I guess I don't have it on this slide, but in the next session, I've got a financial tax proposal. And what we need to do, here, folks, is put a tax over here so that we can grab some of this revenue back to us people in the real economy. In other words, help. And that was proposed, this is a little bit ahead of next time, but James Tobin, who was an economist who got a Nobel Prize back in about 1981, proposed this financial transaction tax, which is called the Tobin tax, but it was never adopted. But his idea was to take back some of this slushing over here in the casino, and bring that money back into the government as tax. And it would be a financial transactions tax, like 0.5% or something, a really, really small percentage. But if you think of how many financial transactions there are, it's a lot of money.
Why don't they ban the banks from investing in the stock market?
They used to, yeah.
They should.
Back when I was 21, banks were simple. Most they could earn was 6% on a...
Yeah, that's all.
Remember when banks were simple? Yeah.
The banks
There was investment banks and there was regular banks, right? Back when I was 21, the market was very simple. You could buy bonds, stocks, or you could put money in your savings account or in your checking account.
And you got interest.
Yeah. I think there were derivatives mainly for the agricultural market, for the wheat and barley and beef and so on, right, Jim?
I could actually purchase them.
But if I have money invested in, like, I don't know what you call it, when you go to a financial planner, right, and you invest your money, blah, blah, blah.
Oh, no.
And I can either reinvest that money or I have that money for me, right? So at some point, I can reinvest that money into the economy, right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, you can take your dividends, if you get dividends from your
Yeah.
stock, and you could bring the dividends will come back into here.
yeah.
So wages, profit, interest, rent, coming back into the households. Okay.
So why does the government create accounts like this, tax savings accounts?
Tax-free
Tax-free
savings.
savings.
It's helping us save.
So they want us to save, they don't want us to spend.
Well, it's still invested though.
Well, it depends what you do with it now. But they're just helping us save now.
And how do
Now,
these-
Harper government, like the TFSA, Trudeau's government doesn't like it, really. They would happily not have it.
So how do these people, like, you can get a car loan for 0% interest? How can they lend out money for nothing?
They don't.
Well, it's not for nothing. It's in the price of the car.
It's in the price of the car.
It's like buying more government bonds with
Yeah.
discount.
Open the wizard, like in the book. Wizard of Oz.
Yes,
And the Wizard of Oz.
yes.
US. It's not the Bank of Canada. Or is
No, the Bank of Canada, the Bank of Canada is really nice compared to the Federal Reserve. That's a terrible arrangement. And I'll say more about this next time, but we can thank Mackenzie King over and over again for him insisting that the Bank of Canada be a Crown corporation. Because in 1934, when the Bank of Canada was established, it was private, just a bunch of private bankers. And then that was when the Conservatives were in power. Who was it then? I forgot. But then when Mackenzie King came in, actually there was a former mayor of Vancouver who was actually became an MP to represent Vancouver riding. He was a bit of a socialist. He was even called a communist. But he really worked hard on Mackenzie King, and so Mackenzie King changed the Bank of Canada to make it a Crown corporation. And it was one of the few central banks in the world at the time that was actually a Crown corporation.
And that's how.
So that was step one. And then within the Bank of Canada Act, it actually says that the Bank of Canada can lend interest-free to the Government of Canada and provincial governments and municipal governments.
Free.
Yeah.
They don't.
Oh, they should.
But then here I'm talking about next week's stuff. And in 1974, Gerard Trudeau was convinced by the Bank of International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland, you mustn't do that. The private banks must be the creators of money. Not, you can't do that. So Pierre says, okay, okay. And so from 1974 on, the Bank of Canada then had to sell its bonds on the market, not keep the interest for the people of Canada.
What was the wisdom behind that advice?
Well, I'll tell you the current wisdom. I've written to the Minister of Finance several times and I get the same old song and dance back from his underlings. We don't want to let governments create money because we're going to create inflation. Rampant inflation. And then they say, remember Zimbabwe? We'll say, remember the Weimar Republic? This is back in Germany in the 30s. Remember those guys there? They had rampant inflation. Of course, today we have Venezuela. Have you heard? Venezuela's got, what, 1,000% inflation or 10,000%. Those are really exceptions. That's where governments have gone wild, printing money like crazy, and the value of the money is worthless, right? But that's the kind of thing you get back from these government bureaucrats. So we don't want to do that because we want the private sector to do it because they can do it in a more reasonable fashion, and they wouldn't do anything like that.
They just make money.
Except what happened in the 2008 financial crisis? Oh, well, you know, that was different. Anyway, that's part of what I was going to talk about next time.
So the deficit is added to the national debt,
Yeah,
and it continues to grow.
yeah.
Where does the interest go now that the government pays in your loops here? In other words, the national debt is going up.
Well,
And so
goes to the-
everybody complains.
goes to the bond.
Could you imagine what would happen if the government, so it's going to continue? But you can't do that forever, because if it continues, eventually the debt, the interest that is going to the bondholder, it's going to be so overwhelming that it'll be it'll be the largest fraction of anything.
Yeah. Well, that's what happened in the US already.
The 80% of
Yeah,
what?
that's happening in the US already. Yeah.
Of your entire budget.
Yeah.
Servicing the debt.
So eventually,
Yeah, servicing the debts.
so eventually, they're going to have to go what you're suggesting. In other words, they'll have to say, well, the government isn't going to lend any more money out. Whatever the government's going to do, it's all going to be at zero interest.
It's, yeah, that's why the interest is low, yeah.
Because otherwise, the whole.
No, what we have to do is the government has to pay off the bondholders, or as they mature, don't renew them, but keep all the Bank of Canada bonds, or keep all the government bonds in the Bank of Canada.
Yeah.
So over time, we could lower our debt, because right now, if you look at the Canadian government debt, up to 1974, we were coming along here very nicely, you know. And then all of a sudden, in 1974, and that's what happened. This is 1974. 1974. And it's just gone up like that.
Yeah.
So now, every year, we're paying a huge amount of money, which is interest.
That's because it's a change in policy.
Yeah.
So
And
just
where is
take
it
the money,
going?
pay it out, and let's go. You know,
Who's getting?
Well, it's gonna come
Well,
down.
interest?
It goes to the bond, like, you
I know,
have
but who are the bondholders? Do
you have a financial portfolio, I bet you it's got lots of bonds in it.
It's got some.
Yeah.
But where, I mean, when you said you can sell those bonds for, I wanted, do you have any idea who owns Canada's? You said China owns a lot of the US,
Right.
maybe owns a lot of Canada's. What for?
I don't know for Canada, I think it's very small. But US is large. Still small, percentage-wise, it's still large.
So mostly Canadians own Canadian bonds.
Yeah.
So we're,
Yeah. Well, but you can say, well, that money's going to a good cause. It's helping your
You would
portfolio, and his portfolio, and her portfolio, you know what I mean?
yeah.
Yeah. In
Is
fact,
that why debt's okay?
virtually all of my portfolio is bonds, because I don't trust the Ponzi scheme that's over there.
How does personal debt, like personal, say credit
Consumer
card
debt?
debt or any kind of debt affect the economy, or does it?
Oh, big time.
Yeah.
Next week, we're going to talk about private debt and consumer debt and government debt, the three of them. Yeah. And they play a big role in the, in the business cycle. So we're going to do that next time.
Okay, so are you also going to talk about another looming problem? Is that virtually every pension, government pension fund is underfunded.
Yeah.
And that is going to come.
Yes.
And it's probably going to come sooner than later. But if you look at cities in
Well-
the US, there's all kinds of them going bankrupt.
Personally, I don't worry too much about government debt. I don't mind if it climbs. I just don't want to have to keep paying interest. I don't mind though if the government, kept increasing the debt, the bonds that it holds, and if it has to have more debt in order to pay off our pensions, okay, that's all right. Because it's our money. We the people own that
We
money.
won't have enough money to pay the debt.
Pardon? Don't have to
Won't
pay it.
ever have to pay the
Don't ever
debt.
have to pay it, no.
It's just the
There's going to be more debt than there's product.
Doesn't matter. It doesn't matter.
Got another one over here.
It doesn't matter. It's us. It's our money. It's our
Well, it
money.
depends who owns those bonds.
Well, I'm saying
If the bonds are owned internally.
the only thing we have to worry about is, we have to worry about how the foreign sector views our money. In other words, if we had a huge amount of debt, would China want to even accept a Canadian dollar? Not worth anything. So that's about the only concern I would have about how much debt we have. Nobody's going to sell Venezuela anything right now. Their money is worthless.
But if you've got a big, well, I guess the US is one example, but if the Bank of Canada bonds are held by foreign investors, that interest is leaving our
Yeah, it's
economy.
leaving, that's right. Yeah. So we are paying them a fee for lending us money.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because we bought the goods, we gave them our money, and it's nice if they would actually buy our bonds, because then we could use that money back into our economy, right? If they don't like our money, we'd have to go to the foreign exchange and convert Canadian dollars to Chinese rupee or whatever, and that might be more expensive, but maybe we'd like them.
Are there any countries, Dave, that are doing the economy like we did before 74? without that interest? Are there examples of anybody
None of the major, I think,
setting
the
up?
Bank of International Settlements has over 60 members, central banks, and these would be the big countries in the world. I think there must be lots of little countries that don't have membership in the BIS, but
So we're all trapped, kind of, in
We're all
in our-
trapped,
our scheme of
in
it.
fact, I've got a few things to say about the BIS next time, too. The Bank of International Settlements, it's an interesting story, how a few central bankers control the
Boy,
world.
next week's
That's
gonna
the
be a great
world.
session.
That's the world.
I was just gonna ask, both the financial crash in the States and also like government, Chrysler or something like that, where they defaulted on the loan guarantee. I don't understand why, if they're making a loan, that they wouldn't be taking an equity stake. Like in the case of the banks down there, I mean, first of all, a bunch of bankers should have gone to jail. So obviously,
Oh, absolutely.
a case of fraud and corruption there that's just gone unaddressed, but still, if you're gonna say, okay, we're gonna give you $5 trillion, we want our name
Yeah,
on all of your
yeah.
bank stocks, or Canada gives Chrysler $6 billion or something like that. And, yeah, okay, we're gonna hang that on to that as collateral, so at some point, if you decide to fold your tents, then you're not just gonna
Yeah,
de-asset
absolutely,
the
yeah.
corporation and leave the pension unfunded, you can just bugger off into the night. Then we now own whatever shit you leave behind.
That's right.
I don't get how they're, I mean, doesn't that seem like a form of fraud? Or misappropriation of public
Yes.
funds by public officials? I mean, it's crazy,
Desperate
politicians.
politicians are trying to protect jobs, yeah.
How's it protecting jobs?
Well, they're-
How would it protect jobs less?
Yes.
If the government had their name on all those bonds, sure, give them the money
Yeah.
and keep the thing afloating, but you don't give it to them with no collateral.
Oh, we're not supposed to own anything.
That's the new philosophy.
We're not supposed to own anything.
It's just security.
Yeah.
Pay it back, you can have your bonds,
Yeah,
your
yeah.
shares back.
You just brought up my
So did you say that next week you're talking about the corporations and like the multinational corporations and
Well,
stuff?
that's a whole
Or is
other,
that third? No, because you've got the government,
Yeah.
in control of this, and there's those that say that the
Well, no.
government isn't in control.
fact, that's the other
but
problem.
corporations are.
yeah, that's the other problem we have is, how do you deal with multinationals? You know, because they don't have a national interest anymore. It's,
No, and they pull the strings and they really.
So they're just trying to scare us, because we're thinking savings and debt and all that.
yeah. So, yeah, in the third session, I've got a lot to say about, what neoliberalism has done to us since 1980.
Are you gonna talk about immigration and how that affects? Because there's so much controversy about immigration in Europe
Yeah.
and in other countries, even, well, the US as well. And Trudeau's saying that if he's in power, he'll bring in 1 million immigrants in the next 3 years, I think so. So like,
That stimulates the economy.
That stimulates the
Well,
economy, that's it.
it
Well, in fact,
depends on
just-
the kind of immigrants you're bringing in too, right?
Right? But
If
that,
they're all refugees, then that's gonna be a
well,
hard.
some of those refugees would be pretty good employees, though. not-
True.
We need
I'm not saying that.
all kinds of workers.
I know.
Refugees aren't immigrants, those are two different categories. An immigrant, you decide, based on their training.
I just heard today that the
Yada, yada, yada.
US,
Oh, okay.
Refugees are
US
in
birth
serious
rate-
trouble, they're
Okay.
on the verge of
the
getting
US birth
executed
rate
or
has
applied
fallen to its
for
lowest level ever, and it keeps falling. And so the US economy is gonna need all these immigrants that Trump won't take in. You know, because you gotta have people.
He has a.
So why don't these countries want them?
Yes, Bill?
All I hear is bonds, bonds, bonds. I don't own any, but I do have a few stocks. Is there any roles for stocks and all of that's going on?
Well, there are some people in here you could ask, but buy blue chip, dividend paying stocks. Don't buy your Ponzi stocks like Apple and Facebook and, you're not buying anything except a Ponzi scheme.
They call it.
Dave, I've got in my files at home somewhere a Zimbabwe paper note or 250 billion. You think it's worth anything?
Worth it to a collector, yeah. Well, I'm happy to keep answering questions. Thank you very much.